session 3, and it's a particularly interesting one for me. It's all about designing and evaluating digital narratives within the museum context. We've got 3 great speakers, first of which is Alyson Webb from Frankly Green & Webb. I referenced her work yesterday, and she's been doing all kinds of interesting work with colleagues in a number of museums around looking at the opportunities and challenges around using research as a design tool in the development of digital services. Alyson. You need to pass that on.
Yes,
I don't think there's a clicker, but you need to hit that. Oops.
Can everybody hear me? Is that all right? So as Carty said, my name's Allison Webb. I'm from Frankly Green & Webb, and we work with all sorts of cultural institutions to help them to use digital more effectively. So I'm going to talk to you today about a project we've been working on. We started work about 2.5 years ago in partnership with the Van Gogh Museum and a digital agency called Fabrique. And the project I'm going to talk about today is this research and design project to deliver a mobile guide in the museum. They had a guide previously, and they were looking to replace it. So my remit today is really to talk about some of the research techniques and the process we used, and kind of give you a sense of what worked, what didn't work. There were some definite pain points associated with that. But before I get into the specifics, that's what we're going to do, I wanted to talk about some things that I think my partner Lindsay and I kind of hold to be eternal truths for us, I suppose. Well, maybe not eternal, but certainly important. The first is that we believe that digital projects are kind of born natively research and design projects. This is partly because of the nature of digital. It's flexible, it's responsive, we can iterate, you can change things very easily. But I think it's also a reflection of where we are at the moment, which is we're all new to digital. The truth is none of us really knows what we're doing and can guarantee outcomes. Lindsay uses this fabulous phrase, which is, she says we're like monkeys with hammers, meaning which, you know, we're not entirely in control of the tool, and we possibly haven't picked up the right tool from the toolbox in the first place. And we have to be honest about that, all of us, whether we think we're digital or we don't, that you know, we need to get to grips with that. And my second point, which echoes, I think, something Carty was talking about yesterday, is that most digital projects are lots of design and not much research. And what research happens typically, I think we heard about a few honourable exceptions yesterday already, for example, the Swedish project, but many of them are lots of design, and any research done is done right at the end. But the problem with that is, without knowing what problem we should be solving, what our users need or are interested in, we've absolutely no hope of doing a great job on the design part. It really is very challenging. And if you only evaluate at the end, you typically have spent all your budget, and there's that horrible moment when a project dies a sad, quiet death. So my third idea is that R&D in digital is about research from beginning to end. And I suppose, as I stood up here and said that we do research, that sounds like I'm being slightly self-serving. We sort of think about ourselves as researchers and designers, and I acknowledge that there is that sort of interest in there, but we didn't start out this way. We come from a background of making stuff. And we came to research because we got so fed up with working on projects where we didn't really know enough to do a good job, and seeing projects die. So it's sort of that, it's been that journey for us. So my view is, if you don't do the research, you're going to get poorer results, you're going to get a smaller audience, and you're going to be less innovative. I think one of the things that we think about is that then research is not something you do, but is a way of doing something. And one of the things that we've come to notice is, if you're doing this, the line between researcher and designer becomes very blurry. That's kind of magical. Everybody gets to be able to make design decisions and choices. Everybody gets to take part in research and really own the data. And I think that's really powerful. Let's get back to the Van Gogh Museum and their digital guide. A little over about 4 years ago, the Van Gogh Museum decided that they needed to change their guide. They wanted it to be more innovative, and they wanted to take control of it. They didn't want to be relying on an external provider. They wanted it to be much more flexible and responsive to their needs, so they could kind of grasp opportunities as they came up. So they really wanted to be in the driving seat. But they also recognised the risk associated with that change. And they did lots of work. They literally trekked the world, meeting colleagues, looking at their guides, looking at the processes they had undertaken, thinking about what had worked and what hadn't worked. And the way that they dealt with that, the risk that they saw and all the information they'd taken in, was to very carefully specify what they wanted and what they wanted the outcomes to be. When they issued the brief and we first saw it, there were 8 pages of requirements, and then they had identified the outcomes. And that was, I have to say, quite overwhelming. And our view is you cannot hang on to both the requirements and the outcomes. If you hold on to both, you're essentially duplicating an existing product. You're producing something that already exists. So if you're going to produce something new, you have to let go of one. And in my view, the best thing to hold on to is to hold on to the outcome, where you want to get to, and let go of how you're going to get there, and acknowledge that the answer might be it's not digital, for example. So that's what we did. We worked with Fabrique and we pitched, and we went into the pitch without any ideas, no designs, nothing. We said to them, if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you always got. You're going to have to do this differently. And Mark DeVette, head of education, who's leading the project, actually said, I think she still doesn't quite know how this happened, but somehow in the process of looking at everything, she had become open to taking a new approach, and she took this huge leap. I think the one thing I'll say is I haven't seen a project like this since. That may reflect just how scary that is, both for the person commissioning, because even if the person commissioning believes in you, they have a whole organisation behind them that they have to convince. So my kind of first learning and challenge really is how do you deal with this situation? You know, because it's so tempting to buy a beautiful, shiny design idea, and much harder to buy a process and a team. But it gave us a fantastic opportunity. This is the Design Council's double diamond design process, and it represents the way in which it is desirable, and I suppose possibly inevitable, that you have a divergence and convergence of ideas and concepts through the design process. A good design process sort of does this repeatedly, and research is a key factor in going through that process. When an organisation typically commissions, it's doing it at this point in the middle. It's telling you what it is you're going to produce. And what the Van Gogh Museum allowed us to do was to take a step back to the previous point, so that we could actually understand what the challenge was. So the first thing we did was investigate the people, and we did a bunch of things. We talked to the museum team itself. We talked to everybody. It's quite a small team, but still we talked to a lot of people. So we talked to finance. What did the business model have to look at? We talked to the front of house staff. We talked to the education team. We talked to the security team, IT, everybody, to understand what really mattered and where their existing pain points were. And we talked to the visitors. We did a big quant survey, and we talked to people who were using the current guide, and we talked to people who weren't using a guide at all. That was fabulously helpful. Why don't you take the guide? I want to see the museum at my own pace. Well, you can guess what one of the concept ideas was termed and what the staff said in the final project. You know, this guide allows you to go at your own pace. We use the visitors' own words back to them. And so right from the beginning, we were capturing really interesting data. I think we spent this time stopping the design agency and the museum pinning down any ideas. There's a real gallop to get to ideas. We stopped them. The only thing we allowed them to do was to refine their outcomes, and they ended up with 2 outcomes: increase usage, improve the visitor experience. That's all they had at this stage. Out of this, we got tons of data, and we had to get to the point where we could identify the design challenge and that they could adopt the data. One of the tools that we use to work through this is what we call the manifesto. It is, as manifestos are, a public declaration of intentions, opinions, objectives, or motives. And we do this as a group exercise. We take people from all across the institution that have a stake in the project, and we get them to pin down what the product must do, be, achieve, not be. And it's a really, the outcome's important because it becomes a tool that you use. So when you're coming up with ideas, you're saying, does this idea match the manifesto or not? That's really important. Does it do this thing that we all agreed was important? No, sorry, it's a great idea, but it's not for this project. But it also facilitates sort of understanding across the team. So one thing that came out from everybody was the guide had to be easy to use, but it turned out everybody had a completely different understanding of what that meant. So the branding and marketing team thought it had to be easy to use because their branding research had suggested that their audience, which is young, and I have to say probably hungover because it's Amsterdam, are not interested in anything that looks like hard work. They want it to be simple and easy. It's a pleasurable experience. This is not going to school. Anything that smacks of hard work, they won't go near. Visitor services told us that they were currently spending a lot of time instructing visitors in how to use their existing guide. So when they talked about easy to use, they really meant easy for them to use. The education team were like, it has to be easy to use for us if we're adding or changing content. We rehang all the time. We do special exhibitions. So easy to use became easy to use in all contexts, and as we worked through, we were able to check in with everybody, and we were able to think about how the CMS worked just as much as how the user interface worked for the visitor. The next tool we used, oh, actually, I should say, just to go back to the manifesto, one thing that I did learn is our manifesto was quite long. It maybe had like 15, 20 points on it. 2.5, 3 years on, what I see is that was too much for them. They really have trouble keeping all those things going in their heads at once. They're still using the manifesto. It's got a lot shorter. I honestly don't know whether I could have facilitated them to get to a shorter manifesto at that point, or whether actually it was a tool that they needed to work with and whittle down themselves. The long list didn't work, but maybe you had to have the long list to have the short list. I don't know that answer yet. It's something I'm thinking about and thinking about how I can do a better job of that. The tool works, it's just how do you get it to the right set of things. The next thing, and this is like the little sketch we did in the as we were producing it rather than the finished thing, is that we mapped the visitor's journey, we mapped all the touch points, and we looked at how the visitors interacted in specific moments, and we used this to identify pain points that we had to fix, or sort of opportunity areas that we could grow. And I have to say, of all the tools we used, this one held so much potential, delivered lots of interesting ideas. We did lots of stuff, but it was also one, I'd say, a slight fail. Yeah, I think it's a fail in some ways. And it reflects the challenge. The visitor services team is small, and they have over 1.5 million visitors a year, and they are overwhelmed. And getting them to take time out to do this activity and really commit to it was impossible. So my colleague Lindsay did it. She spent time and she spoke to them, but she created the map. I think they would have owned the data and been able to use it more had they made it. And I think this is like one of the weaknesses of this process is everybody has to commit and give time to it. You have to be up for that. And the person leading the project may think their project is important and it's their priority, but that's not necessarily the same for everybody. So I think it was useful. So it's great at prioritizing. It's great at developing a shared understanding. It's a visual reminder for people. Oh my God! And it can get a bit overwhelming. So we then went on and did a whole bunch of things. We were trying to stop people from stop ourselves actually becoming the know people and help people to come up with ideas. So through the visitor journey map, we used that to help sort of generate some ideas, and then the visitor services team did prototype stuff. They tested pricing models, they tested marketing schemes. We took the designer on safari as a child in the galleries, so she crawled around on her knees and figured out that if you were that high you couldn't see the labels and therefore you couldn't key in numbers. So in the family guide there are no numbers. We have projections on the floor that can move around, and that's how they access the content. Lindsay spent time on the ticket desk and realised that visitors didn't, we called it a multimedia guide, the visitors didn't. The visitors were speaking a second language, the staff were speaking a second language. They had no means of selling and communicating, so we developed visual guides, visual sort of instructions for staff to use. We did all sorts of stuff. We did prototyping, we did paper prototyping, which is fabulous. You just create a flick book. Brilliant, super simple, anyone can do it. We use things like Axia and Flinto to create quick and dirty digital prototypes. You literally draw the screens, photograph them, upload them, put your hit points in, and you can take it out into the gallery and test. And we sent people into the wild of the gallery and got them to use the guide in a completely unstructured way. We didn't do structured usability. We did unstructured usability because that's life. You hand out a guide, you give somebody instructions, and you send them into the gallery, and you need to figure out what happens to them. And that changed a lot of things. We also ran proposition testing, so we knew what to call things. It was fun and it was intense. And so, as I've been saying, it's really useful. It takes a lot of time. It means being in the same room. We were in London. The museum is not. After we launched, we went back and did the evaluation, and we've been iterating since. We shifted to very short, like week-long design sprints as a means of dealing with that. But it can be challenging. It is challenging. And so I suppose the big question is, why the hell would you do this to people? Because it doesn't sound like a way to make yourself popular, does it? Well, it's really, really simple in this case. Every additional 1% of visitors to the museum, this is based on 2014 attendance numbers, who take the guide, generates over €70,000 income. 11,500 visitors understand Van Gogh and his art better, and 12,000 have a better than expected experience. And we know that because we tested it. And that's the great thing about this process. You know what you're doing and why, and you can then evaluate it. You know what the impact is that you want to have, and you can then get it. So before it was launched, they were doing about 13% take-up. And after they launched, we told them it would go down because they were embedding a new system. Actually, it went straight up to 25 with peaks of 30. So a really positive impact. And I know that 75% of users can, unprompted, articulate at least one of the 4 key learning outcomes they were identifying. You have people saying things like, I thought Van Gogh was this crazy, mad artist, and now I realise that he was very thoughtful and careful and worked hard at his art and studied. That was one, like, they don't want you to think he's a mad artist. That was like, that's their core that they're trying to do. And so we did see increased usage, increased learning. Oh, and we had better perception of the brand as well. I think that's quite interesting. So my takeaways are, if you're a researcher, designer, I think you have to think about your role. You have to think about your role changing through the process, what you need to do. You can't just be a researcher. You have to facilitate people to kind of take on board the results. I think we have to really think about how the practice can be responsive. And I think one of the reflections is this compromise between the strength of the analysis and the need to engage designers and decision makers to own the data. If you have to make the decisions, you have to feel in your gut what this means. You can't have it applied onto you. And it can create lots of impact, but also change. And I think there's a question about how ready some organisations are for that. The Van Gogh Museum is completely up for it conceptually. I don't think they had any idea what was going to happen to them. And it was really hard. I think they're very happy now, but it was challenging to sort of go on that journey to not know the outcome ahead of time, and for Mark to manage all the stakeholders within the organisation and keep everybody on board. That's that.